I'm Pastor George Borkard, and this is another Higher Things video short. Galatians 2:9 and following. Bible study, Thursday. That's the subject of today's Higher Things video short. Hey, if you love our videos, if you have been daring to be Lutheran with us, learning about the Christian faith, hanging with us, what do you think, Thor? Have they been having fun? Of course they have. Go ahead and hit like and subscribe today. You can also go to support.higherthings.org and give today. Your tax-deductible gift keeps Higher Things a youth ministry that brings the gospel to young people about delivering the faith and passing it on to them so they can run further than we run. That's what this is all about. If you think that's important, give today. All right, Galatians 2. We started this last week, and we've made our way through Galatians, and we're at the point in which Paul is defending himself. We had signs of what was going on in the previous chapter, that somebody came in to the Galatians and messed everything up. And what they seem to have done is zero in on something. That gospel that Paul preached was spectacular. But the real apostles are in Jerusalem, and they say that if you want to be a Christian, the first thing you need to do is get circumcised. Well, Paul finds it important to lay out that this gospel that he preached didn't come from somebody else. It didn't come from the guys in Jerusalem. It didn't come from any of them. It came from the Lord. And he when he got this gospel, he didn't go check with them to find out whether it was okay. Instead, he preached the gospel. 14 years later, he goes to Jerusalem and he lays out that he is preaching the gospel to the Gentiles, but not even Titus, who's a Greek, is compelled to be crucified. So that brings us to their meeting. On the contrary, verse 7, when they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the circumcised, just as Peter had been entrusted to the gospel to the circumcised, for he who worked through Peter for his apostolic ministry to the circumcised worked also through me for my preaching to the Gentiles. When James and Cephas is Peter, and John, who seemed to be pillars, these guys are like 1, 2, and 3 on the apostolic rankings. They perceived the grace that had been given to me. They gave me the right hand of fellowship, Barnabas and me, that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. So there seems to be this moment where Paul goes to preach the gospel, goes to Jerusalem, and tells them, hey, look, I'm going to preach the gospel to the Gentiles. You go and preach the gospel to the Jews. I've been called to Gentiles, you to Jews, and we're going to go and we're going to shake hands on it. And they asked us to remember the poor, which was the very thing we were planning on doing. And that also, you can see this in Acts 11-ish. But I mean, what a moment in the church's history where Paul is like, the gospel is for all. I'm preaching to the Gentiles. And they're like, that sounds great. We see God working in what you're doing. You go preach to the Gentiles. Just make sure you feed the poor. And I would have loved to have been a fly in the wall for that, for Paul to be like, remember Jesus on the poor will be with you always, but I always won't, I will not always be with you. And here the disciples are super focused, laser focused on the poor, and Paul is like, yeah, we'll tend to the poor. Just let us preach the gospel. You know what? We could do better. This is an interesting sort of sidebar, and I don't mean to sort of sidebar this, but like, it only takes a little thing for us to get sort of wrapped up in, come here, boy, sort of wrapped up in something other than the gospel. It could be a certain type of ministry. It could be a certain doctrine, and that becomes the big deal, and we forget about the gospel. So we sort of lose track of what's important while we're after whatever it is that we find important. It's a cruel part of me. It's just like, maybe you'll get the treat. Work for it. Anyway, but Paul is like, you know what? If we got to preach the gospel. If we got to feed the poor, we're pro poor. But just let us preach the gospel. And it could have ended there, except for verse 11. But when Peter, Cephas, came to Antioch, I got up in his face. I opposed him to his face. I got up in his grill. Because he stood condemned. It's a perfect passive. He was already condemned. For certain men came from James, he was eating with the Gentiles. Before that, he was eating with the Gentiles, but when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the party of the circumcision. Remember, Paul said, look, if I wanted to preach the gospel, if I want to become famous, I would never preach the gospel. All right? And here, they have this wonderful meeting, and they agree. I'm going to preach the gospel to the Jews. I'm going to preach the gospel to the Gentiles. Well, make sure you care for the poor. Oh, yeah, whatever. Just let us preach the gospel to the Gentiles. But then, Peter is on board, and he's eating with the Gentiles in Antioch until, important people show up. And when some important people show up, he forgets about the Gentiles, and he won't eat with them anymore. He'll only eat up with the circumcised. And the rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with him, two-faced, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. But when I saw their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas before them all, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how are you force the Gentiles to live like Jews? And Paul's point is, look, if you're saved by grace alone, if you're saved solely by Jesus alone, received by faith alone, and that is a reality that changes everything in your life, and you're freed from all the dietary requirements and all the law and all of that Old Testament stuff. You can eat a hamburger or you can eat some crawfish or whatever it is. And you're free to do that. Why would you then compel the Gentiles to be Jews if you don't have to be a Jew anymore? We are ourselves Jews by birth, not Gentile sinners, yet we know that a person is justified, made right before God, not by works of the law, but through faith in Jesus Christ, so that we have believed in Jesus in order that we might be justified through faith and not by works of the law, because by works of the law shall no flesh be justified. So he said, look, the gospel has come clear to us. The gospel, we're Jews by birth, not Gentile sinners. And we know the Christian faith, that salvation is by Jesus alone. Not by a work, not by a way of living, not by a dietary requirement, but by Jesus alone. We live that way. We know that works of the law don't save. Because by works of the law, no one is declared righteous. Declared righteous. No one stands before God by works of the law. No, they stand before God solely by Jesus. That is, by faith alone. By faith in Jesus. We believe this. It's over there, buddy. Go get it. We believe this. And he says it, notice how he says it. He draws them in. Look, we're saved by Jesus alone. We're saved not by the law, but by the gospel. We know this. But if our endeavor to be justified, to be made righteous in Christ, we too are found sinners, does that make Christ a servant of sin? Meginito. That's, you're going to have to forgive me for this, but that's hell no. For if I rebuild what I've torn down, I prove myself to be a transgressor. For through the law, I died to the law so that I might live to God. Hold up for a second here. Look, if while I'm seeking to be justified by Jesus alone, while I'm seeking to be saved by Christ alone, if I'm found to be a sinner, that doesn't make Jesus a servant of sin. It makes me a sinner. If I rebuild what I've torn down, I show myself to be a transgressor. Through the law, I died to the law so that I might live to God. See, that's what the end of the law is. The law, when it comes to its fruition, when it does its thing for us, when it does everything that the law does, it kills us. So Paul says, through the law, I died to the law so that I might live for God. Live by grace alone through faith in Jesus Christ. Live no longer by works and doings and don'ts and all of that, but by Christ, received by faith alone, received in his gifts. I have been crucified with Christ and I no longer live. On the cross, he died. In my baptism, I died with him. I no longer live. I, in my flesh, no longer live. I live, but Christ lives in me. And the life I got going on right now in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave his life for me. So I may look on the outside like I'm alive, but I've died to the world and to sin and to death. I died with Christ. The life that I've got now is Christ in me. No longer me in me, but Christ in me. I live by faith in my flesh, in the Son of God who loved me and gave his life for me. I do not nullify the grace of God. Not at all. If the righteousness were through the law, if righteousness came by what we do and don't do, if righteousness came by not drinking, not smoking, giving my life to Jesus, making a decision for him, having more good works than bad works, if that's righteousness, Christ died for no purpose. We're going to look at this again next week on Thursday, but this is so hugely important. I don't nullify the grace of God because if salvation is by what I do and don't do, if salvation is by any law, anything that I do and bring to the table, then Christ died in vain. That's what is at stake here. What's at stake here is how we stand before God. What's at stake here is the very cross of Christ. If it's 99% Jesus and 1% me, it's all me and Christ died in vain. The only thing that saves me is Jesus. Otherwise, there's no reason for him to die. There's no reason for him to die. Salvation is by grace, that is by faith in Jesus. Believing that he gave his life for me saves me. That's my righteousness. Faith is the very righteousness by which we are counted righteous, which God calls us righteous. That's what faith is. That is my righteousness. Jesus is my righteousness. And so when Paul sees Peter not living that way, he gets up in his grill. I don't care if you're a top dog apostle. I don't care if they call you the Pope. That's a bunch of, it's nothing. Opposed as in comparison to what Christ did for us. Salvation is by Jesus alone. And I don't care if your name is Peter and they call you Pope. If you don't confess that, you're useless. Because if it's any of us in this, then Christ died in vain. Christ died in vain. I'm Pastor George Borghardt. Bible Study Thursday finishes Galatians 2. And this has been another Higher Things video short.